and welcome to my channel. My name is Martine, and if you are new here, I do videos on Vedic astrology normally, but also with some tropical insights. And if you like this video and you would like to see more content from me, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, astrology or tarot, please contact me at the email that I will write in the video description. Okay, thank you. So today's video is going to be on a topic that doesn't have anything to do with astrology. And again, I have been thinking about whether I should talk about this or not. But I feel like I really want to talk about this topic. It's a pretty sensitive topic, I guess. And, you know, the reason I want to talk about it is I don't want to be accused of agreeing by silence or something, or basically some people can mistake silence for lack of an opinion or silent agreement with various things, okay? So that's one of the reasons I also want to talk about it. Also because a lot of the people that are watching my channel are women. Most of them are women, and a lot of them are young women below the age of, I guess, 25. And I think this is an important topic to talk about. I'm going to be mainly addressing this to the women. But of course, it doesn't hurt if you're a man and you become aware of these things as well, and you get to thinking about this. As usual, if you really want to hear my opinions on these topics, and you want to disagree, of course, you are free to disagree, but please do so in a respectful manner. And I would recommend that if you do want to disagree, you watch everything that listen to everything that I have to say on the topic before you try to disagree on anything, okay? And also, bear in mind that before I continue with anything that I say, I'm not saying this to justify basically bad behavior of any kind on the part of any person. I'm simply trying to explain things, okay? You will see what I mean when I get to relevant parts, okay? So, as an introduction, this is a topic that I've thought about, obviously, as a woman, by virtue of being born a woman. I mean, duh. I mean, I should say this. I was born as a woman. I haven't been a man at any time in my life. And now I'm in my fourth decade of life, meaning I'm 30 plus years. I'm in my early 30s. And I have lived a lot as a woman, obviously, and have had various kinds of experiences throughout my life. And this topic of pretty privilege has been something that, of course, I have heard being talked about. Well, not just pretty privilege, but the whole topic of beauty, of looks, especially when you're a woman, is talked about over and over again, especially in the media, in magazines, blah, 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 for a long time, especially for me growing up in the 90s. Mostly it was magazines and Hollywood movies. It wasn't the social media age, but there was a lot of emphasis on women's physical appearance. I will say that. But this whole topic really got to my attention consciously, let's say, to the attention of my conscious mind, I think about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was basically bored in between jobs, sitting at home watching YouTube documentaries on my laptop about true crime investigations, basically murder investigations. And I say true crime, I don't know if that was the title of the documentaries. I watched a bunch of documentaries. All of them were basically murder investigations, okay? And at some point in my 20 to 30th murder investigation, it suddenly dawned on me that all of the victims of murder, aside from the fact that all of them were women, all the ones that I watched were women, which I think is true statistically. Mostly it's women who are victims of murder, okay? There are also men, but, you know, it's mostly women, I think, if you look at statistics. But aside from that, not only were they women, but they were pretty much women that I think anyone would call well above average good looking. In fact, they were from, well, different cultures, different races, even. But again, I think they were the kind of women that pretty much anyone would call beautiful, okay? women with traditionally good-looking appearance, nice figures, symmetrical features, whatever, feminine, good-looking, etc. And that really got me to think about this very, really kind of creepy, worrisome realization that I had, that basically, if you're a good-looking woman, you have much higher chances of ending up dead. And not just that, but the more I thought about it, actually, based on my own experience as well, and the experiences of other women that I've known throughout my life, being good looking really does not bring you any real advantage in life. And I know that this is not exactly the popular opinion. This is not what you're going to hear from the media. In fact, if you listen to the media, they think that, quote, pretty privilege is a thing. And I would argue that there is no such thing as pretty privilege. And I'm going to try to basically support this thesis with evidence and logical arguments based on my own experience, based on other women's experiences, things that I've seen, theories that I've read, etc. And I'm going to break it down why I think pretty privilege not only is basically a lie, but how it actually is actively used against women and against women gaining power in society. Okay, now let me break it down. Okay, so first of all, is there no advantage to being good looking? I would say it depends to a great deal on the individual situation. I would argue that being good looking as a woman, if you come from the right background, if you come from a wealthy family, if you live in a very safe environment, let's say, which I would say that is nowhere in the world right now. No place in the world is 100% a safe environment, especially not for women. But let's say, okay, in a utopian society where you don't have to worry about getting raped and killed on your way to work, then you probably, being good looking does present certain advantages. Yes, people might be nicer to you. You don't have to worry about like I said, you don't have to worry about your safety. Especially if you are born into a wealthy family, right? Your last name is Trump. I mean, look at Trump's daughter. Then being pretty is just one of the long list of attributes that you can add to your resume and call them basically one of the myriad ways in which you are advantaged in life, okay? But if you are born in a poor area, if you are born in an underprivileged environment, I would say being good looking probably puts you at probably 1,000 times higher chance of ending up getting raped and killed, especially before the age of 30, than if you are just not necessarily a bad looking woman, but even if you are just an average plain Jane. And I've noticed this so many times, aside from the true crime documentary. And again, I'm not saying this to justify, but I actually read a study years ago that actually said, for instance, men, their testosterone level goes up in the presence of a woman that they perceive to be attractive. Now, and again, I'm not saying this to justify anything. Bear that in mind. I'm not saying that men have an excuse to behave shady because, their testosterone levels go up. I'm simply trying to point out how men can act like animals, actually, and in fact exercise no self-control and no foresight and no morality. Because in a lot of places, I'm pretty sure that this is one of the reasons why these women in the documentaries ended up dead. In fact, I heard of a story like this from a person I know. Not physically, I know this person online. He and I have been online friends for a long time, and he was telling me the story of a friend of his, a woman, and who was murdered by her husband. And get this, there were no, how should I put it? There was no evidence of violence in their relationship. So it wasn't like this was an abusive husband. They were married for they had known each other for at least 10 years. They were married for at least 5 years. They had a son together. And basically, he just turned on the news one day and he saw that his friend was murdered by her husband. And he said this guy didn't show any hint of being aggressive at all. There were no signs of violence. But here's what I think happened. Now, again, just going a little bit CSI and trying to figure out what happened. What I think happened, and by the way, this guy sent me pictures of his friend, and this woman was very attractive. Like, really attractive. No makeup, in her 30s. She was a natural blonde, gorgeous, very pretty face, whatever. Her husband was not bad looking either. But what I think happened that drove this guy off the edge, and get this, not only did he kill her, but he stabbed her to death like something like over 10 times or something like that. What I think happened is this woman either came home and said, I want this relationship to end, or like, I'm not happy anymore, I want a divorce. And this guy went apeshit and basically killed her, like in the idea, if I can't have her, then nobody will, like a lot of primitive men think. Or, which is equally likely, or maybe even more likely, is that this woman came home and said she's having an affair. Or that she met someone else and she wants to be with this other person. And that's probably what tipped this guy over the edge. He had had some alcohol in his system when this happened, and basically stabbed her to death. And now, as a consequence, the child is growing up as an orphan because his mother is dead and the father's in prison. And whatever. This is just an example that I thought of off the top of my head, sorry. But aside from this, the murder situations, which are the worst cases. Forget about murders for a second. Let's look at all the other different ways that women who are good looking are discriminated against in society. And the reason I can talk about this is because to some extent I have experienced this myself. And the reason I say to some extent is because I don't really consider myself to be a good looking woman. Not in a conventional sense. I never consider myself to be. Because for most of my life, I've been overweight. I'm still overweight right now, minus a few years in high school when I starved myself into an average weight. Basically, I was overweight for most of my life. And I naively thought that being overweight would be enough to shield me from unwanted male attention and discrimination based on my looks and my gender and all that stuff. But let me tell you a little thing about what I experienced in my life. In the first 20 years or so, I was basically not particularly pretty. Looking back at pictures of myself, I guess I was what some people would call an ugly duckling, okay? And it's not like I was actually ugly when I was a kid growing up, but I was never one of those girls that got boys' attention. Basically, especially as a child in the first, let's say, roughly 14 years of my life, I was pretty much a tomboy, okay? I was like, when I was a child, I would be happier, I don't know, collecting frogs versus having a tea party with my friends. And, and I didn't care. I didn't care about my appearance. And when I was growing up, I was blissfully unaware of how lucky I was. Because, I do remember at some point in my early to mid-teens, I became self-conscious. Of course, like a lot of teenagers usually go through that whole teenage angst of not only hating everything about themselves, but me on top of that having to deal with feeling discriminated against because I was overweight. That's actually why I ended up losing weight, but whatever, I won't get into the story of my life and all that shit. But here's the thing that happened, really. Oh, and here's another thing. When I lost weight when I was around 15, I still didn't get attention from men. So I figured, I'm just ugly. Even though, again, now that I look at pictures of myself from that time as an adult, I recognize that I was definitely not ugly. But I was not a Barbie doll, I'm still relatively short. I would say, at best, I can be called exotic. I'm not a Barbie doll. I'm not the ideal of European beauty. Let me put it like that. And I never have been. And when I was a child, I took it for granted. Like, I didn't even realize how lucky I was that I didn't get male attention. Fast forward to, let's say, around the age of 20, 19, 20, I started to change. Let me put it like that. At some point, I think between like 19 to early 20s, my body started to develop. In fact, one of the dramas of my life, actually, when I was a teenager, was that I was relatively flat-chested. Even when I was overweight, I had like the smallest bra cup. And especially, of course, being a teenager, that was a huge complex. I felt like I was not feminine and all that stuff. And then when I reached my early 20s, I always look younger than my age, by the way. I started to develop and I became more feminine. My features became more feminine. And all of a sudden, I started getting male attention. Despite the fact that by this time, I had actually gained all the weight back plus some. And I thought, again, naively, that this would shield me from unwanted attention. In fact, whenever guys would give me attention, I would be in some state of disbelief. I would be like, what the hell? Like, didn't these people get the memo that being overweight is not attractive? And to some extent, for a while, I didn't think too much about it. Except until it started getting worse. And especially once I entered the workforce, and even before that, actually, there were instances where, for instance, I walked down the street, some guy would come over to me and say some kind of disgusting sexualizing comment. Like, you know, I would do this and that to you, that kind of thing. Random strangers would come up to me walking down the street. And I was not that kind of a woman, before you jump to conclusions. I was not like walking around half naked or anything like that. Most of my life I wore jeans and shirts. That's still what I like to wear. And basically I was not the kind of woman that I thought, again, that I was not that kind of a girl that would get this kind of attention. And I was, on top of that, let me track back a little bit. When I was a teenager, because my social interaction was limited to high school, grade school, I went to relatively decent schools. Remember, this was mostly happening before the age of social media. Our teachers were old school, so we were pretty closely knit collectives in our classrooms of about 30 kids. Mixed classrooms of boys and girls. But I was basically used to, we had the same teachers, we had similar backgrounds, all of us. So I was used to being respected and seen for who I was. I was known as that kid who, solved the difficult math problem, or the one who was good in creative writing, the one who had paintings in exhibitions. So I was used to being treated with a certain level of respect, despite the fact that I was not particularly pretty. And I took that for granted. When I was in my 20s, I actually got to the point where, even at work, there were times when I felt disrespected, even, how should I put it? There's no other way, I guess. Disrespected, basically in the sense that men would treat me like a bimbo because of the way that I looked. There was a situation at one of my jobs where I found, after I left that job, that a woman at the office was spreading rumors about me having an affair with a married coworker just because she had seen me talking to this guy twice or something during lunch break. And and when I found out, I was like, what the fluff? And again, coming from a background of not being used to getting attention, not being used to being seen as pretty, I was really naive. I really didn't see a lot of this stuff coming. I went through situations where I had women being randomly bitchy towards me. I had situations where at one of my jobs, a guy coworker would flirt with me in front of his girlfriend. I later found out that that was his girlfriend. And this woman, instead of, I didn't do anything to instigate this. I didn't do anything to encourage this. And even though this guy would do it in a half-joking manner, I could tell that this woman was not comfortable with it. And if anything, started giving me some dirty looks. Instead of confronting her boyfriend and dealing with it between them, I was the one who, got the judgment. Let me put it like that, without actually doing anything except existing. Countless examples. A guy at university, when I was in my mid-20s, I went through a second college degree, and I had colleagues who were 4 or 5 years younger than I was. And a guy whose advances I turned down when I was in college ended up being a coworker at a future job that I had. And because this guy, he didn't say, obviously, that this was the reason, but in retrospect, I could tell that it was some kind of a vengeance shit, because I didn't respond the way that he wanted to his advances. He started spreading rumors about me with higher management, and basically, despite the fact that when I started this job, I was getting very good reviews and it was a great job with great opportunities. Actually, I ended up having to quit that job because this guy was making my life a living hell by spreading rumors about me. And because this guy in question had a higher position and he had higher seniority, let's say he had been there for more than a year with the company, nobody was going to question him. And I got to a point where, despite the fact that I was getting good reviews, good feedback, for my work, I was constantly being told, oh my God, you learn so quickly and all this stuff. I got to a point where one day I got to work, opened the office door, and there were like 3 or 4 of my coworkers. And this feeling where you hear people chattering before you enter a room, and as soon as you enter, like everyone just goes silent, that they were talking about you? That kind of a thing. These kinds of things started happening more and more. And even now in my 30s, sometimes, thankfully not so much, and I think as I get older, I will not get this kind of bullshit anymore. But even now in my 30s, I get shit, or I get called by my name, or I've had like coworkers call me like, hey girl, when I'm like in my 30s because I look like 5 to 10 years younger or something. Which is ridiculous. Imagine being a man and a guy who has worked for everything in your life, and you're now in your 30s and someone calls you boy all the time at work and makes you feel disrespected or trivialized. This kind of a thing, okay? These are just some things that I can think of off the top of my head. And I got to a point where another thing is that when I traveled to Western Europe, because here's the thing, in Eastern Europe, I think to a large extent, it's still a safer environment for women, especially if you're overweight, because on the one hand, a lot of women are very good looking in Eastern Europe. And on the other hand, it's like, I think East Europeans are way more, how should I put it? Weight conscious, I think, maybe. So I actually ended up getting worse levels of way more unwanted attention once I traveled through Western Europe. Where, again, more instances of just random strangers coming up to me, asking me out, and, on all this shit. And it may sound funny, or like, I think men mistakenly think that this sort of thing is flattering to women, but they don't understand what it looks like from the woman's perspective. They don't understand the fact that as a woman, it's very easy to feel physically intimidated by a man who hits on you, especially if he doesn't take no for an answer the first, second, or third time that he asks you out or some shit. Or they mistakenly think, like, I actually remember one time some years ago, I was on this forum where I think some feminist topic was being discussed, and I was complaining about some of the stuff that I have just said right now about unwanted attention, and this guy commented and said, just wait until you turn 40 and no guy's gonna notice you anymore. And I was like, you promise? And I was like, I can't wait for no guy to notice me, because here's the thing, women, I'm not saying any of this to talk about how cute I am or any, don't take this the wrong way. I am simply trying to illustrate my perspective, and I'm going to get to more relevant points in a bit. Aside from this, aside from showing my personal experience, I actually, again, this is something that I wanted to say. I took for granted when I was younger how much more respect I got when I was not seen as attractive. And fast forward to in my late 20s, despite having achieved a lot more through my own efforts, working hard, getting 2 college degrees, getting my own place and all this stuff, I actually get less respect. Because I'm a woman who, also probably not just because I look relatively pretty, but because I look younger than my age. Actually, another fun part that came to my memory now, a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, before the apocalypse of 2020, my AC broke down in my apartment, and I had to go change it. And this guy, like, without knowing anything about me, I remember what happened. I had to cancel the first appointment or something like that because something interfered at work. Back then, I was working night shifts, and they had changed my shifts, and I had to work on that day. So I had to call this guy and tell him, please don't bring the AC. Don't send your employees today with the AC because I have to work. I won't be able to attend, whatever. And this guy got pissed at me and started saying some shit like, because I was there, I was there in person at first, so he saw me and talked to me like I was some kind of a bimbo, some kind of a rich bimbo on daddy's money, looking to change my AC. He started saying some shit about, well, could you please be more serious about this? We have people with families and children who get their AC changed. And I was like, bitch, what the fuck is this about? Like, I don't care about your other customers. I'm a paying customer. Like, and I'm paying for this out of my own wallet. I didn't say this to him, but I was like, the fact that he talked to me like that, it really bothered me. And I realized even back then that I'm pretty sure that if I were a guy, he wouldn't have talked to me on that tone of like, oh, we have people with families, like basically meaning we have serious women, you know, asking for our services, unlike bimbos like you or something like that. Again, maybe I was too sensitive, but I'm a person who trusts my instincts, and let me tell you that I could tell by his tone that he thought that he could talk to me as if I'm less respect worthy or something. I don't know, whatever. Probably, again, because I look younger than my age. Like, even now, being in my early 30s, I have people telling me I look 23 to 25, which, and even if that were the case, even if I were 23 to 25, it's not a reason to disrespect someone. Because you don't know anything about that person unless you're an idiot and you make constant assumptions about someone based on their physical appearance, which is unfortunately, I think, a huge number of the population of the world. This is why I talk about the Aruda Lagna and the illusions of the Aruda Lagna and why people should stop projecting on others. But whatever, let me not digress too much. So anyway, this was my personal experience. And not just aside from my personal experience, let me tell you some of the experiences of people that I have come across. I had a coworker, actually, yes, I had a coworker at one of my jobs who actually she was the one who was tasked with basically giving me like showing me the ropes at the new job. And she was 6 years younger than I was. And she was this really pretty woman in her early 20s, slim, blonde, very pretty, very young looking. And she told me some of the shit that she went through at that job. And aside from the things that she told me, I, with my own eyes, saw coworkers disrespecting her, talking to, making sleazy comments and sleazy jokes at her expense that I don't even care to reproduce. But unfortunately, I think in Eastern Europe, sexism is still very much alive and well. And, it's like basically the general mentality of men at the corporate environments is like, if you don't like it, then stay at home, if you're a woman, I mean. Hopefully, I think it has changed, and I think it will change now because a lot of jobs are remote if for no other reason, but whatever. So not just this, but she actually told me 2 stories that really semi-traumatized me. One of them was, she said, so I had gotten this job in, I think, September or October, and she told me a story of something that happened to her the previous summer. And she said that before that, so the company was a relatively small company. They had like only, I think, 30 employees in the summer or something like that. And then suddenly they started hiring more in the autumn. But they were actually a small company. A lot of people were working shifts, and they actually had their office in a house with a garden in this kind of quiet neighborhood in my city. And because it was the summertime, it was like during a heat wave. There were like 40 degrees Celsius or something like that. We usually get that in the summer. And it was a heat wave. They decided to have like a barbecue in the yard. And it was basically unspoken that it was a semi-casual day. It was supposed to be a short work day on a Friday. And she showed up for work in shorts, like a lot of the men showed up at work in shorts because 40 degrees weather. What can you do? And a lot of women showed up in shorts. And she said one of the senior women at the company made a complaint about her appearance to the HR department, saying that she is improperly dressed, that she was too informal indecent. I don't even know exactly what word she used, but she basically made the complaint to the HR department about this woman's appearance, despite the fact that the woman in question, who by the way was a senior, was a manager about 20 years older than her. This woman, I knew her because I had seen her around the offices. She would walk around the office in really tight jeans on stilettos and with her boobs half hanging out, like and clearly to me, and again, this is the kind of random bitchiness that good-looking women have to deal with on a regular basis. And basically this woman, even though it was like not said, probably she didn't directly confront her, obviously it wasn't a direct confrontation, but the woman basically went behind her back and made a complaint about her appearance, probably because she was jealous that this woman, this younger woman, was getting more attention from the men at because this company was mainly men, okay? It was like an IT startup, whatever. This is an example. Another example that traumatized me, something that she said while we were working there. She came to work all traumatized about the fact that on the previous evening, she was coming home, she was going home from work, and a guy, so she was waiting at the street light. She was going to take the bus home, and she was waiting for the street light, at the street crossing for the light to turn green. And a guy showed up from behind and all out of nowhere started pulling her arm and basically started pulling her in front of the cars. So the light had turned actually green for the cars. The cars started running, and this guy was basically pulling her in front of the cars, and the cars were like honking, and the people behind the wheel were like honking, and she was like, "Who the hell are you?" And she said that she was vocal about it, like, "Who are you? I don't know you. Let me go." And none of them, even though there were a lot of people around, nobody interfered. And she basically managed to pull away from this guy with like every strength that she had and ran towards the bus stop. And she said that she was lucky that the bus was there and she jumped in, and this guy couldn't jump in at the last moment. But basically she saw him running after the bus. And she said she was so fucking traumatized by this experience, like she was afraid to leave the house. And this woman, by the way, it was a woman who had a boyfriend, was in a relationship. Because the reason I stress this is because, a lot of people say stuff like, "Oh, well, just say you have a boyfriend." Yeah, right. Some guys will just come and drag you in front of a, obviously this guy was imbalanced or something was wrong with him. But this is just an example of random stuff that, I'm sorry to say this, women who are not particularly good looking don't have to deal with. Let's be real. Or at least as far as I've seen, I haven't seen this happening. And of course, it depending on the situation. I'm not trying to say that if you're a plain Jane or like if you're not particularly pretty, that nothing bad can ever happen to you. But let's be real. Based on my experience, based on my observations, this rarely happens. And also based on my personal experience, when I was not particularly attractive, I was free to do whatever the hell I wanted. And I took it for granted that I was quote unquote invisible. And yeah, these are just some examples that I could think about, okay? Again, this is the kind of stuff that women who are above average good looking have to deal with. And I just wanted to talk about some experiences of women that I've known and my own personal experience, but I'm going to get to the conclusions at the end, okay? Another experience that I know, a woman who I went to university with, again, very good looking, really very good looking, tall, blonde, was into modeling, I think, when she was in high school. This woman, again, got a lot of random hatred from both men and women when she was in university. And the reason I kind of knew her pretty well was because we were study partners. I would go over to her place every now and then, and we would study for tests, exams. We had projects together, whatever, when I was in university. And because both of them, we were living at home as opposed to the vast majority who were at the dorm room. And whatever. So this woman in question had a boyfriend, and well, we were not super close, we were not super friendly, and the reason why we didn't become super close friends was because really we didn't have much in common, aside from the fact that we were going to the same university. And, we would get along well as study partners, but we didn't hang out that often outside of the study interests, okay? But when I was going home, of course, she would start talking about her life in between study stuff. And she told me that she had just graduated high school, of course. I was a little bit older, so I started a second degree when I was 23. She was 4 years younger than I was. And she said that she was engaged. And in fact, I was there after she had just broken up with her fiance. The guy was a prick because I had overheard I had overheard in the sense that I was there when she had like some kind of a, over video chat conversation with this guy after they had broken up. And I could tell by the tone of his voice that he was a total narcissist based on the way that he was talking, the stuff he was saying, etc. And also the stuff that I later found out that he did to this acquaintance of mine. So anyway, basically the story that she told me was this was her first real boyfriend. This was the first man that she had been intimate with. She said that at first she didn't even like him. But so they went to high school together. He was, I think, 1 year older or something like that. Or I think he was around the same age. Yeah, I think he was around the same age, but like in a different classroom or whatever. But they were going to the high school together. And basically throughout sophomore year, this guy had pursued her, showing grand romantic gestures to the point of serenading her outside of her window, buying her gifts, bringing her flowers, doing everything to attract her attention and get her to get into a relationship with him. And she said, maybe I should give this guy a try, even though she didn't really like him that much. So she did give him a try. And then eventually she became attached to him. She became in love with him. He was her first everything, like first romantic, whatever, boyfriend. They got engaged before he went to university. And here's the thing. He decided that he wanted to go to university in a different country. And what happened was, after the first or second year of university, all of a sudden, he just basically announced that he found someone else and that he wanted to break up with her. And she said that she actually knew who this person was. And based on the stuff that she was telling me, like the fact that this guy told her that initially had told her that she was the best woman for him, that she was the ideal woman and whatever. All of this stuff kind of really sounded like narcissistic grooming to me. Basically, love bombing. And what is my point with all this? My point is that if you're an above average good looking woman, you're way more likely to attract men who only see you as a status symbol. A lot of men approach women who are good looking, not even necessarily because they themselves find them attractive or because they feel any kind of feelings for them. It's just because women who are good looking are a status symbol. They're like getting a Lamborghini and parading it in front of your friends or in front of the neighborhood. And this was unfortunately the case with this woman in question. So this guy basically did everything in his power to attract her, to get her wrapped up around his little finger. And then as soon as he found a newer model, literally, I think, basically broke up with her. Not only broke up with her, but actually was cheating on her beforehand. She found out later. Whatever. And these are some of the things, okay? This is just stuff that I can think about off the top of my head. And here's the theory. Here are my theories about this. First of all, about this pretty privilege bullshit. Some women, not just some women, some people think, men think when they say that women have pretty privilege, they think from their perspective. They think as a man, from a man's reality, and they think, men having 10 times more testosterone than women, they think, if I were a pretty young woman, I would be out there screwing my brains out. Because they think like a man, and they ignorantly make assumptions about what women need and what women want in relationships. And the reality of the situation is that women, regardless of what they look like, when it comes to romance, they only want to have one guy. One guy, and oftentimes for most women, it's hard to even find that one guy who is decent, who is respectful, who will give them the commitment, the security, the monogamy, the emotional connection, and everything that a woman needs in order to be fulfilled in a relationship. That's it. So if you're a woman who is very attractive, you might attract a lot of men, but none of them might be the one guy. Like, so really, you're just attracting more BS, more drama. And in fact, if anything, if you're really good looking, especially conventionally good looking, these women who go to modeling courses and whatever, it's actually even more difficult for them to find a decent man, because a lot of the decent men are going to look at these women and, again, making assumptions from their ignorant male perspective, thinking, well, if this woman is good looking, she must have slept with dozens of men, which is actually not true. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit, actually. But either they're going to make this assumption, or just from a purely pragmatic point of view, they're not even going to go for these women because they're going to think they're out of their league, or that these women are out of my league. You know, a woman who's very attractive is not going to look at a guy like me. Or they're going to think I'm going to have to deal with too much competition, because if a woman is really good looking, then a lot of men are going to be hitting on her, and I'm going to have to deal with that. And they don't even approach her. But instead, they attract a lot of narcissists, a lot of psychopaths, a lot of men who are not necessarily confident, not necessarily even having a higher social status, just having a very strong sense of entitlement, of thinking that, well, you know, I'm a great guy, I drive a nice car. I turned down a guy like this when I think I was already in my 30s, actually, a few years ago, whatever, who was like this totally arrogant narcissist at one of the companies that I work for. He was younger than I was, a senior programmer in his late 20s, and he acted like he was the shit because he drove a BMW and had some kind of a, I don't know, high-paying job. I could just smell the narcissism on him before I even knew what narcissism was. This guy acted like an entitled prick, like somehow, and when I turned him down, understandably, usually it's these kinds of men who give you crap for turning them down, or even for politely turning them down, like saying, hey man, I'm not feeling it. I don't feel attracted to you, or like, you know, whatever. Sorry, I'm not getting the, like, I'm not feeling the chemistry here. You know, and no matter how politely you turn down these kinds of men's advances, they will take offense, you know, and they will act like, who the hell do you think you are to turn down a guy like me? And, you know, this kind of stuff that, again, if you're not a particularly good looking woman, you never have to deal with this shit. Never. And you take it for granted. Aside, where was I? Oh, yes, the assumption that women who are good looking. Actually, I remember reading this study some time ago that actually said that, contrary to what men assume, women who are very good looking have lower numbers of sexual partners. And as far as I have noticed, that's actually true. And again, I'm going to ruffle some feathers here. And I'm not saying any of this to offend anyone or anything like this, or to be patronizing. I'm just stating facts here, okay? Like, based on my objective observation, based on stuff that I've seen, I'm just trying to point out how people can act like animals on a regular basis and not be aware of it. That's the really sad part. The really sad part is not even wanting to open their eyes and recognize the error of their ways. But the reason I say this, and again, this makes sense from an evolutionary biology point of view, because for a woman, it doesn't make any sense that women would want to sleep with hundreds of men. This is just BS that has been propagated by the porn industry, by the media, by basically men, okay? Because the porn industry is made by men for men, okay? They don't care about you, they're just selling you junk, like McDonald's is selling you junk, okay? And they're selling this idea that basically women who are good looking are out there, you know, sleeping around, having loads of partners. Complete horseshit. In fact, some of the statistics and the studies, again, I read this study that said, actually, the more conventionally attractive a woman is, the lower the number of sexual partners she's going to have is going to be. Which, again, like I said, makes sense because women are selective. Unlike men. For a man, it's the opposite. The more attractive a man is, the higher his social status, the more likely it is for him to be sleeping around with loads of women. But this is like, so people who are making these kinds of assumptions of like, oh, if you're good looking, you're promiscuous, are just ignorant from every perspective. And again, I have actually noticed this to be true. Most women who are very good looking, the ones that I have known at least, they have married the first or second boyfriend they ever had. Or maybe they didn't marry, but they're in long-term relationships. And conversely, I have met some of these women that are not particularly good looking who are constantly sleeping around. And the reason they are sleeping around is because they're secretly hoping to attract a man who's willing to finally have a serious long-term relationship with them. And it's really sad when you think about it, but of course it doesn't apply to all women. I'm not trying to say that because it depends. Of course, it really depends on the circumstances. Of course, it also depends on if the woman is religious or not, etc., what culture she comes from, etc. But as far as I have noticed, generally, basically, the more options a woman has, the more selective she is going to be. Because it makes sense from a biological perspective. Okay, that was something I wanted to say. But aside from this, I'm going to talk about the women's perspective now. And this is why I talked about my experience. Because here's the thing. When I was young and naive, I used to buy into the lies that Hollywood said. Not just Hollywood, the media, right? I mean, you would turn on the television, and especially when I was growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s, I remember even as a child thinking, why, like, as a woman, you're not worth anything unless you're good looking. Because I would look at the movies, I would look at TV shows, literally all of the women who are in movies, almost all of them, even the ones who sometimes quote unquote portrayed unattractive women were women who are pretty, you know. They were just not drop dead gorgeous, unlike the main protagonist, you know. So as a woman, I remember feeling invisible, especially once I was past the age of puberty, past the age of 12, 13. And especially in high school, I remember there were instances where I felt really invisible. Like I felt this is so unfair because, and if you're a woman listening to this, I'm sure you can relate. Circumstances where I would be, let's say we were out somewhere in the city with a group of friends, and as soon as some really good-looking woman would show up in a group of friends or something, all the boys would just have their eyes on her. And it immediately made you feel invisible. Like, it made you feel like this is not fair. Like, why did the pretty girls get all the attention for just existing? So there was that side of it. And there was also this impression that women who are good-looking had it easy because, again, the media, Hollywood movies would sell you this idea that if you were a good-looking woman, you were the main protagonist. You were the woman that everyone wanted to be around. You know, you were the most charming, you whatever, had the Prince Charming, whatever. But of course, as it has turned out in recent years, what they didn't show you was the fact that some of these actresses who played the leads had to prostitute themselves to get that particular job. And but this was my naive perspective as a teenager, looking at the Hollywood movies, looking at the media and thinking that it must be so wonderful to be a good looking woman. It must be so wonderful to just get all this attention for free and having preferential treatment and money and a job and all this stuff. Once I experienced a little bit of the other side of the coin in my 20s, what I realized very quickly is that this is complete bullshit. In fact, I, as a woman who have absolutely categorically refused to prostitute myself in any way, either to get my rent paid or to, I don't know, for anything. And when I say prostitute, I'm not just talking about like literal prostitution. I'm talking even about women who get into relationships, in monogamous relationships. Let's be real. A lot of women get in monogamous relationships. I have met a lot of those women just to have their bills paid, or just to live in a nice neighborhood with a guy who has an apartment in a nice neighborhood, or to drive some guy, to be with a guy who drives a nice car, or a guy who takes them on fancy vacations. I've come across a lot of these women. And a lot of them, yes, are above average good looking. And they call this privilege. But is this privilege? And here's the thing. What I have noticed is that the women who do this kind of thing, first of all, are not honest. They're not even honest with themselves. One of my childhood friends, actually, I knew her since we were 6 or something. We went to school together. We were classmates. And like, similarly to me, she actually looks like me. Funny, someone told me that we look alike. And she was really good looking. Entered her 20s and her late teens looking very good. She, grew up being the ugly duckling from a poor environment, and she became very good looking. And what happened was she attracted a guy with a lot of money, a foreigner, and she is in a relationship with this guy. The last time I talked to her was about 5 years ago. And she was telling me that this guy, this was again her big first love, her, whatever, first guy she was ever intimate with, whatever. I think they were married even religiously, but not legally. And this guy basically point blank told her that he felt it was his right as a man to sleep around with as many women that he could get his hands on, basically. And this friend of mine, like, I couldn't even recognize her anymore when she was talking about this shit. She was like basically trying to convince herself and trying to convince me and herself at the same time as she was telling me these things about her relationship, that she was happy with this, arrangement. And yet I could tell a mile away that she was very angry. Even now when I have her as a Facebook friend, and in all of her pictures, in all of her posts, she comes across as a very angry person. And she was telling me about this, saying like, I don't mind if she sleeps with other women, because to me, these are not women, like women who just spread their legs for any man. And I was thinking like, bitch, are you crazy? So let me get this straight. They're not real women, but he's a real man. Despite the fact that he cannot exercise basic self-control, he has no self-respect, no dignity, no morals, no nothing. Like, what kind of a man has no self-control, first of all? Like, that's not a man at all. That's a monkey. That's a chimpanzee. And here's the thing. In this situation, she basically says things, and even around that time, I could tell that the reason she was with this guy was because she came from a poor background. And this guy had money, and he was even now, he's taking her on exotic vacations. She's posting lots of pictures on social media about how happy she is. But in the meantime, the stuff that I was hearing as the friend was actually that she was actually very angry, very frustrated. And, by the sound of the stuff that she was saying, even considering cheating on him in return, because, I don't blame her. And blame her because she doesn't have the courage to look at the reality of her situation and say that she's not happy and just leave the guy, right? If the guy doesn't give you what you need, then just leave. But this is an example of the so-called pretty privilege. A lot of these women who post pictures on Instagram and social media about their luxurious lifestyle, they're all prostituting themselves one way or another, which is a very sad thing for a woman. Let's be real. You can't tell me shit. If a woman is not in a relationship where she has emotional connection, commitment, security, monogamy, basically any kind of a physical relationship she has with a man is her agreeing to being raped. That's all it is. She cannot actually enjoy that. Change my mind. You know those memes with change my mind about this because you're not going to manage to change it. And I've come across a lot of these women who are so, I would say, even cut off from their own nature and their own needs that they will, agree with these kinds of arrangements just so they could put the pictures on Instagram and try to make other people jealous and try to get the social status that comes with it and portraying themselves as so successful and so happy, when in reality they're not at all happy. They're not at all feeling successful, even though they might be successful according to society, because society only sees the surface of things. And this is my point. This is why pretty privilege is no privilege at all. Because, and look at all these, like, you might argue, okay, what about these people who are these women? Like, every now and then, again, just to give you another example of the fun of pretty privilege, I watch Jonna Jinton's channel every now and then. And if you don't know her, she has a channel about her life in Sweden. She has some house in the wilderness somewhere in the northern Sweden. Now she's with her boyfriend. But I remember watching a video of hers about 1 or 2 years ago where she had a video on, okay, she has a huge channel, yes, with, that has, I think, won awards, probably makes her a lot of money. She has a business surrounding her channel and her presence on the media and all that. But there's a cost for all this. She's a very pretty woman. And she had a video, like I was saying, a year or 2 years ago, where she was talking about a stalker entering her private home, basically urinating on her artwork. She does artwork for, among other things, for a living. She's an artist, right? This guy urinated on her paintings. Like, and she was talking about how her entire saga with this guy, because he had been stalking her for a while. She went through repeated, attacks, repeated reports to the police before they even considered doing anything about it. This is just part of the pretty privileged bullshit. Now, and again, if she were a man, you might argue, but she wouldn't get as much attention if she were just an average looking man. I don't think so. If she would have put up the same content with the nice videos of the Swedish wilderness and stuff, she would have been free to just do whatever she wanted without having to worry about her safety. She could have shown her face without worrying about her safety. Like, that's the way that I see it, at least. And this is the thing. This is where I'm going to get to the part of how this works against all women. It works against all women because the women who never go through a phase of being particularly pretty, they don't realize all the shit that comes with it. They don't really understand the stuff that these women have to go through. All they think about is these women who are maybe above average good looking. And they think that they must have such an easy life, that they must have had an easy ride. And I would say BS. And again, you might argue, I know some women who are not particularly good looking, and they'll say things like, yeah, but these women are so arrogant. The women who are good looking, they're so arrogant. They act above me, or they act above other women. First of all, I would say that's true. I have met some women like that, but I would argue that even those women, they act like that for a reason. Probably because other women have made fun of them or have poked all kinds of crap and evilness in their way throughout their entire lives, and they are defensive. And basically, they are rubbing their higher status in everyone's face as a last resort to feel, empowered and superior and in control of the situation, when in fact they're not happy about the situation. And even if, like I mentioned with my friend, and I've seen a lot of these women who think that, by sleeping with the manager and getting a higher position, that they are doing so much better in life than the average looking women. But these women in the process lose their self-respect, their dignity, even their soul, I would say, with the risk of sounding dramatic. And they become an empty shell for the sake of, wearing the Louis Vuitton purses and going on fancy vacations and posting pictures on Instagram. On the one hand, and first of all, even if this woman says something shady, because again, I come across these women who are usually narcissists, by the way, these women who use their beauty as a weapon and sleep around with all the right men. And first of all, I would say don't even try to take the bait if this woman tries to bait you into an argument. Okay, I'm talking to women here, especially. If she is immature, if she is superficial, then let her be that. Then let that be her sin. Let that be her fault. Let her embarrass herself. And maybe just at best pray that someday she will turn around and realize the error of her ways, okay? And otherwise, why would you waste your time on these kinds of women? These kinds of women are immature at best. Okay, so, but don't try to generalize. Don't think that just because some women are like that, that all women who are above average good looking are like that. That's really the main thing that I wanted to say. And aside from that is this issue of pretty privilege is just one of the million ways that basically chauvinists of the world use differences between women, especially looks, to pit women against each other. The truth is, and I've seen this repeatedly, there are some men out there who are perverse enough that they love. Some of them even love to rub it in their girlfriends' faces. They'll say things like, oh, this woman has much bigger breasts than you. Or and I've seen a lot of these shady assholes get away with all this kind of crap. And the women, instead of calling out their bullshit, do nothing about it. Or they take it personally. and they get shy and, insecure about it. And, men love to see this stuff. They love to see women pitted against each other, being catty towards each other, attacking one another based on physical appearance, women calling other women fat and full of cellulite. They love to see this shit. You know what? Why? Because they see this as divide and conquer. As long as women attack each other based on stupid, irrational reasons like their physical appearance, they will always stay in a weaker position in society. That's the reality of the situation. Because, and this is really the main thing that I wanted to get to, women, this cattiness stuff has got to end. And I've seen it a lot. Like, I've seen it from both sides of the equation. Because really, and again, this is also something I wanted to say, I don't know if I mentioned it until now, that basically being good looking is just a different kind of invisible. That's something that nobody tells you. Because you're not seen as a person. If men like you, they like you because of your looks. Maybe they're physically attracted to you, but they only see you as an object. I've gone through, again, situations where men would just project shit on me. And when I didn't act like their assumptions and their projections of the perfect, I don't know what the hell their fantasies were. When I didn't act like the fantasy, they started getting shitty towards me and angry towards me. And I'm not even talking about men that I flirted with or it was in any kind of relationship with. I'm talking men that I had minimal interactions with. And they thought that they could be bitchy towards me. And this is something they don't tell you. They don't tell you this about the so-called pretty privilege. Every single one of these women who seems like they are favored because of their looks, there is something that they are missing, that they are giving up in order to take advantage of the so-called pretty privilege. If I would call this a privilege, I would call being pretty a privilege if you would just get stuff for free. Like if you got a free parking lot, I don't know, if you got money from the government every month coming into your bank account, calling it the pretty privilege, I don't know, scholarship. And you would have to do nothing in exchange, then I would call it a pretty privilege. But as long as you are expected to prostitute yourself to get any kind of advantage, because let's be real, these women who are good looking, even when they get hired for their looks, it's because the boss and by the way, I also know cases like this. Women who were hired maybe because of the way that they look. I don't know if they realize that or not. I can think of one example specifically of a woman who told me that basically her manager started putting the moves on her, and when she turned down his advances, basically he started to make her life hell. And eventually she had to quit her job and take a job that paid half of what that job paid just because her manager was a prick. And whatever, there's a long discussion to be had about why she didn't seek legal action. That's a long story. But it's not really all that simple and black and white. But these kinds of situations happen all the time. So, I mean, this idea that, oh my God, it's such a privilege to be good looking, I would say there is little to no truth in it. Because, like I mentioned, in all situations, with very few exceptions, like I mentioned, if you are born rich, then maybe you can say being pretty is an advantage. But if you are not born rich, I would say forget about it. Like, being pretty, if anything, is going to make your life way more complicated. And it's actually, in the long term, going to create a lot more obstacles for you. Because if you just want to have, like, an average, living your life in peace kind of existence, 100% is going to complicate your life a lot more. Think about a woman who looked like Marilyn Monroe wanting to be a rocket scientist. Do you think that her life would have been easy? I would say, well, in her day, it was impossible by virtue of the fact that she was born in a very chauvinist era. But even nowadays, women who are very good looking, if they go into a STEM field, they have to deal with a lot more harassment and objectification because of by virtue of these fields being male dominant, and men thinking that because they're in the majority, they can abuse women for fun. And this is the stuff that nobody tells you unless you hear it from people who have actually gone through it. That's the reality of the situation. And another thing that I want to say, what did I want to say? Oh, about women who are not particularly good looking. I've come across a lot of these women. And there are a few things that I noticed about them, okay? And again, I try to be objective because I was one of them. I'm pretty much started to say this. I was one of them, and when I was one of them, I was naive about a lot of things. And also, a key thing that I want to stress is that when you're not particularly good looking, these women don't really see the ugliest sides of men. This is one of the things that I noticed. Like, I've actually seen this time and again where women who are not particularly good looking and they hear of a case of a woman who accused a man of sexual harassment, for instance, or some kind of improper behavior, they tend to side with the man. They'll say things like, well, I worked in the corporate environment for 2 decades and nothing like that ever happened to me. Which is, a totally irrelevant argument. Just because it never happened to you doesn't mean that it doesn't happen to other people. And these kinds of women, they don't see the ugliest side of men. They don't see men being assholes to them by virtue of them just turning down some advances. They don't see the catcalling. They don't see the objectification. I've had a situation where a guy at work groped his genitals in front of me while making eye contact when nobody was watching. If I would have said this to anyone, nobody would have believed me. And these are things that happen to you. If you're above average good looking, they happen to you, once a month. And add to this the fact that, as a woman, you're much smaller than the people around you, than the men around you, and you have to feel, it's much easier for you to feel physically threatened and intimidated and unsafe by conclusion. And that's to continue this idea. The women who are not particularly good looking, I've seen this time and again. Like, I was thinking about this. I saw this part of an interview where a man was questioning a woman. I don't even know what the topic of the interview was. And the woman, again, she was not particularly good looking. She was very slim, very fit, but her face, she was not particularly pretty. Let me put it like that. I'm very objective about these things. And this woman was saying something like, I have a friend, a male friend, I could tell from the conversation, who was accused of sexual harassment because he just put his hand on a woman's knee, on a coworker's knee, she said, who happened to be a woman. And the woman in question immediately reported him to HR. And this woman who was being interviewed, she said that these cases of harassment have gone too far and that women are exaggerating. And I remember listening to this and thinking, does she even realize how ignorant this sounds? Like, think about it this way. If you really, even if you're a woman, regardless of if you're a woman or a man, if you really have doubts about whether behavior, especially in a professional setting, is inappropriate between genders, you have to ask yourself a very simple question. If this were a man, would I still think that this was appropriate behavior? So in this situation, if these were 2 men co-workers, ask yourself the question of when would it be appropriate for a man to put his hand on another male co-worker's knee? And when you put the question like that, you realize immediately that no matter what the context was, this was inappropriate behavior. Now, of course, you could argue maybe it was too much for her to immediately go to HR and say that this guy was harassing her because he happened to put his hand on her knee. But having gone through harassment myself, I know that that's never how it happens. It's never like, this thing happens one time and the woman immediately goes crazy and goes to the HR. It's usually repeated stuff, little things that add up over a period of time. This could have been the last straw. But even, let's say, this is the first time that it happens, you need to understand the context of that, okay? Because if it's a question of the guy was falling down and he accidentally touched her knee while he was falling down to the floor, then I would say it's an exaggeration. But if this guy was touching her knee in a sleazy way, making eye contact, despite the fact that she was clearly uncomfortable, I would say, yes, it's perfectly within her right to make an accusation. What's the problem? But here's the thing, again, the woman in question, not being particularly pretty, probably never experienced this kind of thing. And I've seen this, again, having gone through harassment myself. I had a video up a while ago, I don't know if you've seen it, where I talked about my experience of having gone through harassment. When I made an accusation, a lot of the women in the office didn't, I don't know if they sided with the guy, but I could tell that they didn't really fully believe me. Because they assumed that, well, if I haven't seen this guy behaving in a way that is inappropriate, then it must mean that he's not inappropriate, which is, completely ignorant as an assumption. Anyone will tell you this. Anyone who's ever studied narcissists and psychopaths will tell you this. Whatever, that they don't do the same behavior to everyone. But I digress. But these are some of the things that I wanted to say. And the reason I say this is, again, when I was not particularly attractive, first of all, even when I was not particularly attractive, I never made assumptions about women that I didn't know. I didn't just look at a woman and assume that, oh, if she's pretty, she must be a stuck-up bitch. Or if she's pretty, she must have slept with hundreds of men or some stuff like that. I never made these kinds of assumptions because I was mature enough to not generalize, to just not make assumptions about a person that I don't know. But having gone through being, let's say, above average good looking and seeing the random hate that you get from women, sometimes men, for no other reason than just existing, I have a lot more empathy right now. And again, like I mentioned, there is no real privilege. Not really. Because, yeah, like I explained before, basically, if you're good looking, let me put it to you like this. I would say being rich is a privilege because you're just born wealthy. Shit, if I would have to choose between being ugly and rich and being good looking and poor, I would choose ugly and rich any day, any time. Because if you're ugly and rich, you can do whatever the hell you want. You can hire prostitutes if you're horny. I mean, even as a woman, you can do whatever the hell you want. You don't have to wait around. You don't have to take orders from a boss. You don't have to, whatever. But if you are a woman who is good looking, but you're poor, you don't have any, sometimes you are even forced into prostitution. That's another totally different topic that a lot of these women, again, I think about women whose channels I follow on YouTube. A lot of these women who are really good looking came forward at some point and said that they were molested as children. And which again does not surprise me because usually, predators are not going to be attracted to kids who are not particularly good looking or women who are not particularly good looking. They're going to go for the women who are good looking. Those are the ones who are going to catch the eye. Look at Teal Swan, for instance. Teal Swan, of course, yes, it wasn't demonstrated and a lot of people attack her claims. But again, I won't get into it again. This is really going to drag on. But as a person who, let's say, has gone through narcissistic abuse in my life, I can perfectly understand the double reality concept. And I watched a video where she was talking about her experience being ritualistically abused. I don't find it difficult to believe, actually, that she actually went through that. There were a lot of people attacking her claims and saying that, how is it possible that she was part of a ritualistic abuse cult and at the same time going to school and, I don't know, skiing or whatever the hell she was doing. It's perfectly possible because this is what happens. This is called a double reality where, a person who is abusive forces you to behave a certain way when nobody's watching. And then in a day-to-day basis, you are forced to keep appearances. And again, Teal Swan, very good looking. Even when she was a child, right, she was good looking, which is probably why she attracted the wrong attention. And again, I'm not saying any of this to be like, oh, poor good looking, for you to be like, oh, poor good looking women or good looking men. Again, I should probably do an entirely separate, I think it is possible to do an entirely separate video on men because even men who are good looking attract the wrong attention. I won't even get into that. But I think it's much worse for women because women in general have not just a lower status in society and on top of that have to deal with chauvinism, but also because they're physically weaker than men. They're much easier targets for all kinds of abusers. So they have to worry about their safety a lot more. But yeah, basically this is what I wanted to say. I'm pretty sure that I have forgotten some ideas along the way. But basically, yes, this is what I wanted to say. And again, I would be curious to hear what you want to say about this topic if you have anything to say. But of course, please try to be respectful in the comment section. And yeah, this is what I wanted to say, and especially if you're a young woman, I really wanted this video to be basically about stop buying into the media brainwashing that you have to be good looking or that your looks define your sense of self-worth, because they don't. Even if men tell you otherwise, forget about that. Just focus on your own sense of self-development, your own sense of self-confidence, your own sense of identity, and make sure that none of these things depend on things that are fickle, like your appearance. Basically, that's something that I can say as an ending, is that for me, I never defined myself through my appearance. That's why even now, shit, if something would happen, heaven forbid, and I would be the ugliest person on earth tomorrow, it would make no difference in my life. Because I haven't built a life on my appearance. I don't rely on my appearance to make money. It doesn't define me as a person. My sense of confidence, my sense of self-esteem do not come from my appearance, because that's the way that I wanted it to be. Okay? Because I never bought into the illusion that your appearance as a woman defines your worth. And this is something that men throughout the centuries and even nowadays constantly use to pit women against each other. So, I mean, just don't fall for it. Okay, that's what I want to say. Okay. So, thank you for listening if you have listened. And once again, if you have liked this, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, tarot, or astrology, please email me at the email in the video description. Thank you.